I will talk about what's called the cognitive revolution. And that's the period mainly during the 1950s and 60s when computers and programming were developed. And then new models of thinking became possible, and I will talk a bit about the consequences of that. I had planned for a background here, a very philosophical background, but it turns out that most of my topics have been covered by other speakers. I can be very quick. So we've heard about Descartes' dualism of body and mind. I want to point out that he was classified in terms of epistemology as a rationalist. You can create knowledge by just sitting and thinking. That's rationalism. And against that, you have philosophers like Locke and Neumann, who are empiricists, says that we need the only reliable knowledge we can get from our sensory experiences. These are the contrasts. And then you have Immanuel Kant, who is a kind of a compromise fellow. He says that, okay, we have the empirical sensual perceptions, and then we have our constraints, the Anschauungsformen of the mind that constrains our thinking. Yeah? So these are the three main epistemological positions in philosophy. I need them as a background. And then in psychology, we already heard about Watson's behaviorism, so I don't have to say very much about that. He studied these connections on this. What I want to point out that you can view behaviorism a little bit as it's the mapping or the relation between the stimuli and the responses. That's the input and the output. And for behaviorism, that was a black box, but it was forbidden to study it. I mean, it was unscientific to look for what's going on in the black box. You can't talk about expectations or learning or anything like that. That's in the black box. You couldn't talk about that. So that's the black box, and I'll get back to that. Now, there is another trend, and that's in philosophy in the early 20th century, and that's a tradition called logical empiricism. And at the end of the 19th century, people like Frege and Peano has developed logic and formal methods of arithmetic and so on. So they thought of formal logic as the ideal form of thinking. This is the real top form of thinking. And coming back from the Greek model of axiomatic geometry, they wanted to put axiomatic thinking as the peak of the scientific knowledge. So Frege and Peano in particular developed axiomatic system for the arithmetic. And then in Britain, Russell and Whitehead put this into formalism as well and made it into a philosophical ideal, you can say. And an assumption of this tradition is that all knowledge can be expressed in some form of language. And ideal knowledge is expressed in logical formalism or some kind of mathematical language. That was an ideal for the logical empiricists. So they wanted to analyze philosophical problems using logical analysis. I mean, using some kind of logical inferences to solve these philosophical problems. And that gave rise to the tradition within philosophy that's called analytic philosophy. That's been dominating the Anglo-Saxon and many other European countries during most of the 20th century. So that's the background of ideas I want to build on. Then we come to 1930s, 40s. We see beginning to thinkers that begin to study what can be done in terms of computing. And they started from this idea of the axiomatization of mathematics, or rather arithmetic. But an important thing here is that depends on understanding what's called recursive functions in mathematics. I don't want to get into what that means, but that's the central part of arithmetic. In order to derive the mathematical theorems, you need to use recursive functions. And then a logician, Alonzo Church, he didn't prove it, he claimed that everything that can be computed with the aid of recursive functions. That was a kind of dogma within the tradition. Then came Alan Turing. And in 1936, he showed that a particular machine, nowadays it's called a Turing machine, can be constructed. And it consists of a central head that reads a tape. And the tape is basically infinite. And the head runs left and right on this tape. And based on very simple instructions, depending on what's written on the tape, depending on the state of the head, something will happen and it will move right or left and write something on the tape maybe. And it's a very simple machine. But Turing proved that this simple machine can do anything that can be done with recursive functions. So basically it can compute anything that can be done within mathematics. And that was a kind of astonishing proof. Then people started trying to build these kinds of machines, and they didn't build Turing machines because they were too simple. But there was the mathematician von Neumann who designed a kind of architecture. There is a controller unit. This was the head of the Turing machine. There is an input and there is an output. There is some kind of logical calculation, not part of Turing's original. There is a memory, and then you can have an external memory as well. This is a general architecture for a computer that von Neumann constructed. And in the 1940s, people started building machines of this kind. And they were mainly used for mathematical purposes or for statistics and so on. But Turing realized that these machines could be used for other things than for arithmetic. So he wrote a paper in 1950 called Computational Machinery and Intelligence, where he said that in principle they can handle any kind of symbolic operations. They can run on language and so on. And so he was forecasting that we would use these machines to do more things than mathematics. We would do them for thinking, for intelligence. And then his question was, how do we know whether a machine is intelligent? And in this paper he formulated what's later called the Turing test. And that is, if you can't distinguish what a machine is doing from what a human is doing, then it passes the Turing test. So that's in the 1950s. Another great breakthrough was, or idea here was, neuroscientist McAuliffe and logician Pitts, they formulated in 1943 an idea that the neurons in the brain, they work as logical circuits. And these logical circuits were then used in these first primitive computers. They were instantiated by electron tubes, electrical things that were very costly and very hot and whatnot. But you can construct a von Neumann machine using these logical circuits. And what they saw was an analogy between the neurons and the logical circuits. And they thought that, this is a picture of the cortex, the 6 layers of the cortex. They thought that each neuron was a kind of logical circuit. And if this is the case, then the brain could be seen as a computer. And that was the idea. That's the central idea. So that's the source of the very central metaphor here. The brain is a Turing machine. And that's the beginning. That's the dogma of the cognitive revolution. Around, idea come here, but it was developed in the 1950s and 60s. And basically you can identify 1956, around that time, as the peak of the cognitive revolution. First event was in Dartmouth College. There was a first conference on artificial intelligence. That's where the term artificial intelligence comes from. It was given by the programmer John McCarthy. And there was a congregation of people doing computers, philosophers, linguists, and psychologists, and so on. And one thing that was presented there was a program written by Alan Newell and Herbert Simon. It was called the Logical Theorist. And it was a program that didn't do mathematics. It did logical calculus. It could prove propositional logic, theorems in propositional logic. So there was this fairly simple program with modern standards. But anyway, this program has been seen as the first program that can think. Because logical thinking was the ideal of analytic philosophy, and this program could do logic. So that was kind of a breakthrough. Chomsky was not at the meeting, but he had, the year before in his PhD thesis, he had proved a parallelism between different kinds of automata, finite automata, push-down automata, and Turing machines, and particular kinds of formal languages, finite languages and so on, and up to. And what he proved was that for a natural language is recursive in the sense that you can take a sentence and embed it in another sentence, and then embed it again, and so on. For Chomsky, this is recursion. And he proved that in order to handle languages that have recursive embeddings, you need a Turing machine. You see the point here? Languages need a Turing machine. If the brain is a Turing machine, we can understand why we can handle natural languages. So there were many things flowing together here and creating a kind of common thought around this metaphor that the brain is a Turing machine. And then in psychology, there was George Miller, who in 1956, the same year, wrote a paper on the working memory of humans. And he had, this is the 7 plus minus 2 units. We can remember 7 plus minus 2 information units. We can remember a telephone number that contains 7 digits. Well, an information unit is not just a symbol. It could be a word. We can remember 7 words. We can remember more. But basically, he gave a number of examples showing that the human mind has a limited capacity to remember information. 2 remarks here. First of all, he's really using information theory. And information theory was developed by Claude Shannon in the 1940s. He was working with telephones and telegraphs and gave a mathematical theory of how you can measure the amount of information that is being transmitted and how secure the transformation is, that is how many errors are made and so on. And it's from his theory that we have these notions of bits and bytes and baud and so on. And that fits very well with computers. We can measure the information that's transmitted in computers, and Miller was building on information theory here. The second remark I want to make is that this is the first clear example of filling in the black box. The brain is now studied as what is the capacity, the information capacity of the black box, the brain. And that's what Miller is studying. So that's a clear break against behaviorism. And that trend follows, strengthened during the 1960s. So there is a lot of research on memory based on these ideas and lots of other studies of learning and thinking, logical thinking, that concept formation that is based on these ideas of information and logical calculations. So that's the peak of cognitive science. In philosophy, we're coming to this problem of what is the mind. We've heard about Descartes' dualism. Per talked about neutral monism. I didn't put it in, but we have the identity theory saying that mental states are identical with physical states. That's a materialistic theory. And then it's replaced now by functionalism. Hilary Putnam publishes a paper in 1960 where he proposes that it's not a matter of the brain or a computer. It doesn't matter whether it's silicon or whether it's blood and meat and so on, neurons, that determines whether it has a mind or not, but only the function that the system has. That's what determines whether it's conscious or not conscious. So that's a new kind of theory of what the mind is, what consciousness is. And of course, that's dependent on the computers being developed. We can ask the question, can a computer be conscious? And if you can show that a computer has exactly the same function as a human brain in a particular area, then it is conscious. And you can see that this is basically the Turing test, but the Turing test multiplied a little bit to more complex questions. So AI started in this sense. There were problems for AI. So 3 people tried to use Chomsky's theory of language to do machine translation. It didn't work. There were so many problems. I don't have time to get into it. The von Neumann architecture with a central processing unit and inputs and output didn't fit the brain. the brain doesn't. You couldn't find a central processor in the brain. Memory research failed. I mean, memory was saying that in a computer the memory is located in a particular unit, transistor or what in the computer, and neuroscientists try to find out where a rat remembered a maze it's been learned and so on. And a number of rat brains were sacrificed to this, and it failed. You couldn't find the memory of where the maze was located in the brain. There came a lot of philosophical criticism. Most famous is Searle's Chinese room. I don't have time to talk about that, but he basically says that computers don't understand the meaning of what they are processing. They miss the meaning. They can be, so it's implicitly a criticism of functionalism as well. What happened then was that the Turing machine metaphor was basically in the 1970s replaced by a new form of computationalism. These are the artificial neural networks that were starting to be developed there. And so the neurons operate in parallel, and you take McAuliffe and Pitt's idea and then you put it in a network like this, different layers. I mean, there are many different architectures for neural networks, and then you feed some inputs, maybe pictures, and you do a classification and training, and then you can get an output that can learn to classify pictures or patterns of different kinds and so on. And this has exploded nowadays. We have most programs in artificial intelligence depend on neural networks, and they depend on what's called deep learning. Deep learning because there are many layers. I mean, there are tens of layers in these networks. So the neural networks have replaced the Turing machine, but basically it's still a kind of computationalism thinking about the mind here. Yeah, and they are very good at learning classification things, but other topics they are not so good at. And another topic that's been developing since the 1970s is cognitive neuroscience. You can think of McAuliffe and Pitts as the first paper in the era, but the breakthrough was David Marr's book on vision in 1982, where he showed that you could tell you could show how the visual process works from what gets into the retina is transported back to the visual areas on the occipital cortex, and then you get process of different layers. So the first thing that the system does is to identify lines in a figure, and then you get surfaces, and then you build them together to get a three-dimensional object and so on. And Marr presented a computational theory of this visual process based on what was known about the brain at the time. He has... Yep. I have. So they are modeled by neural networks. They have used imaging techniques, brain imaging techniques, to understand where things are happening in the brain. But these techniques only show where things are happening. They tell us very little about how they are happening. They tell us very little about the processes. So we still don't know much about how the brain is handling the information. If you believe in neural networks, you may know something. We don't believe in the Turing machine analogy anymore. But this is an ongoing area. So, thank you very much.
So, what is going to happen next in the cognitive revolution?
One thing has happened, and that is that we don't think of the brain. Part of the Turing machine and the neural network idea is that the brain is an isolated entity. It does all the thinking. There is developments in the cognitive science that the brain is embodied. It works together with the body. And then there is situated cognition saying that it works together with the body and the surrounding world. So there is no isolated computational system. That's one trend that has been very strong the last 2 decades.
Is the development of computers adapting to this new knowledge?
To a certain extent. In robotics, they are definitely adapting to the embodied and the situated models, because robots can't only think, they have to interact with the world. So that's an extension.